George Floyd, a black man in Minnesota, was crushed to death by a white policeman, triggering protests and demonstrations in at least 140 cities across the country, and violent protests in a few cities. With the protests that have lasted for 2 weeks, a series of complex topics have been widely discussed. On July 4th, in the 4th issue of the Race Issues and the Torn American Society online series hosted by the New York Cultural Salon and the Bay Area Cultural Salon, UGC, a PhD map of social movements as the title, sorts out the historical context of the American Black movement. The lecture was divided into 3 parts. The first part mainly talked about why the history of specific social resistance and state violence was downplayed or even erased, and the challenge and transcendence of the Black Power movement to the ideology of the civil rights movement after the decline of the civil rights movement. The second is the issue of race in the American left-wing movement. How the racial and class contradictions intensified by immigrants have continuously torn apart the tradition of radicalism in the United States in the past 100 years. Finally, entering this wave of Black Lives Matter movement, the legacy of the historical Black movement can be glimpsed from the characteristics it embodies. Zian authorized the paper to publish the transcript of the lecture for readers. Social movements and the public memory of Black liberation. When people talk about social movements today, they are not just talking about the movement itself, but rather shaping a historical perspective, a way of understanding and remembering the movement after the fact. All social movements are filtered by the media system and academic research at the same time, and the filtered facts will be imprinted into history and become a text of public memory and political argumentation that will be constantly evoked. For example, the Black Power movement that emerged in the mid-1960s has not had many video records and academic research until now. The only relatively complete documentary is the Black Power mixtape, which was shot by a Swedish TV reporter. It recorded some fragmentary images related to the Black Power movement from 1967 to 1975. It was compiled into a film and released in the United States 10 years ago, but because many materials were missing, some years have no material at all, so the overall perspective is not very comprehensive. But in the 1960s and 1970s, no American media was willing to conduct in-depth interviews with the Black Power movement, so even documentaries were made by foreigners. Moreover, the Swedish filming team was blocked by many parties at that time, criticized by the US government and media organizations for spreading negative energy, and could not see the progressive side of American society. American society has a rigid memory of social movements and strong racial prejudice. First of all, the history of social movements has a strong white centrism. Much research has focused on white-dominated movements, such as the New Left. Similarly, books with Chinese translations are basically limited to the New Left movement. There is also a great deal of research on how movements during the civil rights movement, such as the sit-in protests, affected attitudes among white Southerners. The unspoken assumption was that the success of the Black movement was determined by white people. Moreover, white males also dominate the historical narrative. The memory and discourse of the New Left are monopolized by white core players. As a subdiscipline that crosses sociology and political science, social movement research has extremely serious internal racial and gender divisions. Not to mention that the 3 theoretical research masters Tilley, Tarrow, and McAdam are all white men, and there are almost no women of color active in this field. Scholars who study race, women, not social movements in general. Ordinary social movement researchers seldom personally participate in movement organization work, and there is often a huge disconnect between research and social movement practice. The first 2 factors are of course also subject to an important structural problem, namely the bias in the historical archives of social movements. Participants in white movements and more moderate Black movements are better documented. McAdam, Doug McAdam, has a masterpiece called Freedom Summer, which tells about the long-term impact of participating in the Freedom Summer project on the lives of volunteers, how they start thinking about changing society after participating, and participate more in politics in their future lives. But the reason why McAdam was able to write this book, which is almost the foundation of social movement research, is precisely because 90% of the volunteers of Freedom Summer are white, and the archives are very complete. The information on Black organizations, especially the radical Black movement, is very scattered, and many of them are in the hands of the FBI and CIA. Even if the information is declassified, it will take many years to wait. The newly exposed stories will also subvert people's cognition. For example, The only Japanese American Richard Aoki who reached the top level of the Black Panther Party was also the East Asian man in the famous picture of Yellow Peril supports Black Power. It was only exposed in 2012. A long-term FBI informant, he successfully broke into multiple organizations and provided countless important intelligence to the US government. Japanese-American Richard Aoki appears in famous historical images of Yellow Peril supports Black Power. When it comes to the Black liberation movement that started in the 1950s, the problems presented in its history are more concentrated. I summarize 5 points here. The first is leader-centered memory and analysis, especially when explaining the divisions of the Black movement. It will bring up Martin Luther King, Milk, and Malcolm X. It seems that everyone else's movement belongs to these two men. Footnote. This problem exists even when talking about other organizations, such as Huey Newton when talking about the Black Panther Party, and not paying much attention to the contributions of other members, especially female members. The second problem is that state repression is largely downplayed. The most typical example is the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO for short, illegally implemented by the FBI under Hoover in the 1950s and 1970s. The project tracks organizations large and small within the civil rights movement, the New Left, the Black Power movement, and the Radical Left. The FBI also directly planned the assassination of rising Black Panther star Fred Hampton and his bodyguard Mark Clark. At that time, Hampton was only 21 years old, and organized a very potential inter-ethnic alliance Rainbow Coalition, inviting radical organizations of various ethnicities to join. This officially denied murder was also one of the main reasons for the disintegration of the Black Panther Party. In addition to violent suppression, the government also used methods such as falsified communications to defeat the Black movement. For example, they would pretend to be members of other organizations and write letters insulting the Black Panther Party, provoking distrust between organizations, or publicizing that someone is FBI or CIA informants. This strategy is also called badjacketing. The FBI's COINTELPRO program is known because 8 operatives infiltrated the Pennsylvania FBI's regional office in 1971 and stole over 1,000 documents, which were later released to major media outlets and Congress. Otherwise the relevant information will not be released until decades later. Today, although the FBI's monitoring and suppression are restricted to a certain extent, they still have special monitoring projects targeting Black radicals. For example, the price leaked in 2017 shows that the FBI regards Black Lives Matter as Black identity extremism movement, but this movement is completely fabricated by them. In mainstream discourse, Black activism has long been seen as violent, separatist, and socially tearing. Even supporters of the civil rights movement tended to take this position. White new leftists such as Todd Gitlin have long claimed that Black radicals destroyed the racial unity reforms of the civil rights movement. They also believed that Black radicals had betrayed the civil rights movement, which led to the rise of post-70s conservatism and the culture wars. But in fact, if you really look at the history of the 1960s and 1970s, you will find that the movements in the 1960s may not have bridged social differences at that time. Those images of Black and white people fighting side by side have a lot of romantic elements, but they are considered separatism. Black radicals did a lot of work for ethnic unity after the 1970s. In the history of Black sports, the participation of women, especially women at the bottom, has always been downplayed. For example, far fewer people know Claudette Colvin than Rosa Parks, even though the former was the first person to refuse to give up her seat to a white person. Because Parks is more in line with the stereotyped image of a protester than Colvin, she is a married garment worker who works in the local NAACP, so the NAACP deliberately portrayed her as a leader at the time. But Colvin was a 15-year-old single Black woman who became pregnant shortly after giving up her seat. Her body was stigmatized by society. At that time, even in the Black community, no activist was willing to publicize her deeds. In addition, Angela Davis also mentioned on many different occasions that the struggles of countless ordinary Black women have created milk. For example, the Montgomery bus boycott was initiated by Black women's organizations at the beginning, and a large number of Black women in the service industry who took the bus were commuting. But later historical narratives emphasized more on the organizational work that Milk and others intervened afterwards, and Milk became a core figure in the civil rights movement. Sociologist Belinda Robnitz's research also revealed that during the civil rights movement, most Black organizations and Black churches generally rejected women's core leadership positions, and Black women could only be promoted to the middle level at most. Therefore, the exclusion within the organization stimulates them to do more work of coordination, communication, and education, and they become nodes linking different communities. Ella Baker, the founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at SNCC at the time, is a good example. She has done a lot of behind-the-scenes work for the movement, including discovering and cultivating the next generation of activists. Her more pro-grassroots activism also left her more marginalized in the memory of the civil rights movement, with a strong distaste for charismatic leadership. The last question is the Americocentrism that the United States is very good at on any topic. With the exception of the Vietnam War, historical narratives rarely place the United States in the context of global campaigns and the Cold War. After entering the 21st century, there have been many discourses on this aspect, but in general it is still not enough, and many of the existing discourses are more romantic in the Third World, and there is not much analysis of internationalism in the 1960s and 1970s. The game between political movements. The discourse of the 1960s in the United States is often placed in a simplified good 60s/bad 60s dichotomy, which roughly means that the first half of the 1960s was good, and the movements were all nonviolent and carried out within the framework of the system. There were also some civil rights advances. By the late 1960s the Black Power movement was on the rise and everything was heading towards riots and riots. Much has also been written about how this dichotomous memory of the 60s was solidified. The first, called Framing the 60s, is a look at how politicians of both parties can evoke memories of the 1960s to serve their party's agenda from the perspective of party politics. Another book, The Bad 60s, analyzed the video works of the 1980s and 1990s, and found that the mainstream cultural circle effectively dispelled the politics of the black movement by highlighting the good 1960s and various white subcultural products. People might admire the dress of the Black Panther Party, thinking that they created a fashion trend, while opposing the ideology of black self-determination behind them. Another book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, reflects on how American society shrugs off the historical burden of slavery and racial segregation by commemorating the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement has been described as a kind of self-purification and redemption of American society, paving the way for the subsequent colorblindness politics, colorblindness. The rise and legacy of the Black Power movement. Although there was a trend of Black Power, thought during the civil rights movement, the rise of the entire Black Power movement was in the late 1960s, especially after 1968. Disappointment with the mainstream civil rights movement and the efforts of the SNCC in electoral politics, the general desperation sparked by the assassination of Malcolm X to Milk and JFK were immediate triggers. The Vietnam War also created an opportunity for the spread of black radical thoughts, because for the first time, blacks, especially blacks who participated in the war, intuitively felt that as oppressed people, the fate of the slaughtered Vietnamese was connected and isomorphic. Former SDS member Max Elbaum cited a survey in the late 1960s in Revolution in the Air, showing that 30.6% of blacks who joined the army hoped to join a radical black organization like the Black Panther Party after returning to the United States. A background that people tend to overlook when they look back on the 1960s is that even with the moderate position of Milk in the early days, there were very few people in American society who supported him. In fact, only 28% of Americans had a favorable opinion of Milk in 1966, which shows that the civil rights movement absolutely did not have a basis for public opinion at that time. At the end of May 1961, Gallup conducted a survey on the just-started Interstate Freedom Riders movement, and 60% of the respondents were opposed to it. What is even more telling is the comparison of public opinion before and after the March on Washington in 1963. After the Black Nonviolent March, the society became more resistant to the black movement. The proportion who believed that nonviolent protests harmed racial equality soared from 60% to 74%. The data for 1966 showed the same trend, with 85% of whites feeling that the civil rights movement had hurt blacks' pursuit of equality. Therefore, the assertion that many white new leftists claim that American public opinion has become conservative because of black power is untenable. Defenders of racial capitalism don't feel any more sympathy for a social movement and reason. So it's the ideology of white supremacy that's been strong all along that drives the rise of black power, not the other way around. Comparison of public opinion before and half a year after March on Washington in 1963. It is generally believed that the earliest black power organization was Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM. Although there was no concept of black power at that time, This organization has always emphasized the liberation of black people all over the world since the development of black colleges and universities. It also came into contact with it earlier than the Black Panther Party. To Maoism and Leninism. Because RAM was active during the heyday of the civil rights movement, they have been working semi-underground in order to avoid state repression. This also led to the fact that although the organization is actually large in scale and has many branches, very little information survives, and many of them are from the source. In the files of the CIA and FBI. For example, the CIA data released in the 1960s according to the Freedom of Information Act showed that they were officially considered the most dangerous organization at that time. RAM also inspired the creation of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, the former being a member of RAM before Nation of Islam. The concept of Black Power was coined by Stokely Carmichael, who chanted the slogan at a rally in Mississippi during March Against Fear in 1966. In his early years, he was also a moderate who supported the civil rights movement. He participated in the Freedom Riders movement, was influenced by the aforementioned Ella Baker, and also led the SNCC. However, in the mid-1960s, he basically had no illusions about the line of the civil rights movement. After Stokely chanted Black Power slogans, most civil rights leaders panicked. Roy Wilkins, chairman of NAACP at the time, directly said that this was the father of hate and the mother of violence. Milk also believed that the slogan was unfortunate, so Stokely took it back, but the latter sternly rejected it. In addition to the factor of time change, this kind of line divergence is largely an intergenerational issue. Stokely was born in 1941, and Milk was born in 1929, which